right. Welcome to 1 Kings. Let's open our Bibles to 1 Kings. We are making our way rapidly through the Word, and normally we are able to find Christmas in our passage. We're getting close to Christmas, so good luck finding Christmas in the passage that we're in. It's very difficult. We're at the last good stuff. After this, it's tough. So, 1 Kings chapter 1, the first part of the story is to introduce us to a character that will play a role later that will be important. And so, just kind of to get us going, we'll just read through the first 4 verses. So the setting is set. King David is now old, advanced in years, and they put covers on him, but he could not get warm. So David's getting to the end of his life, and so we're going to transition from him. And David can't stay warm, and so they have this idea. It says in verse 2, the servant said to him, "Let a young woman, a virgin, be sought for our lord the king, and let her stand before the king, and let her care for him, and let her lie in your bosom, that our lord the king may be warm." And so they sought for a lovely young woman throughout all the territory of Israel. They found Abishag the Shunammite, and they brought her to the king. The young woman was very lovely. She cared for the king and served him, but the king did not know her. Now, if when you read that you thought it was weird, the reason you thought it was weird is because it is. This is an example of sexism. This is inappropriate. When you're old and you can't get warm, in those days David, there's brass. They can take a brass pot, they can put hot rocks in it, and they can put it in his bed. He doesn't need to have a young unmarried girl laying with him. It's inappropriate. It's wrong. But David, remember, had many wives. He's already violated what the Bible said for the kings. He's not supposed to multiply wives, and he multiplied wives. He doesn't do it to the level of Solomon, and so he doesn't have the exact same consequences as Solomon. But he fails in this area, and that at this point in his life, of all the things he's gone through, that this suggestion is made, and he thinks it's a good idea. I think primarily we're hearing this story because of his relationship with this girl. He never has a relationship with her as a husband and wife, but she has a special role with him, and you'll see that has an impact later. So I think that's kind of primarily why we learn about this. But we want to be careful. I think a great application right away is don't make strange allowances for your flesh. Better to say no to the flesh than say yes to the flesh. So we get right into the action of the story because as David's now old, he's coming to the end. One of his sons, verse 5, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And we're told in verse 6, his father never corrected him about this or asking him, "Why have you done this?" He was very handsome, and he was born after Absalom. So interesting that having seen what happened to Absalom, he does almost the exact same thing Absalom did. He makes a parade. He has 50 people running in front of him, and he's like, well, how did that turn out for Absalom? It's interesting, there's the old saying, history, will repeat itself, or people don't learn from history, and you have these amazing examples, and the guy does identically what Absalom did, as though he would get different results. And so what we'll see, and this is a good place to introduce it, because we're going to see this pattern in your reading for next week and the following weeks as we finish the story of the kings in the next several weeks. We're going to see people vying for power. The lust for power. It's one of the drives of human nature to gain power, and it infects and influences the kingdom of God. That's why Jesus is such a difference maker. He's a different person. He told his disciples, "My kingdom is not like this, and the world is like this, but not so among you." And we have to constantly be on guard against this. And this guy, verse 5, you couldn't say it more clearly. "I will be king." That's the quotation. I'm going to be king. Now, who said he's supposed to be king? He said it. Did David say it? Nope. There's an even more important opinion than David's. God. Who gets to decide who's king in God's kingdom? I think that would be only God's decision, and this guy decides it for himself. This is an example of what we call self-promotion. We'll see this repeatedly. Self-promotion, selfish ambition. The New Testament speaks directly about this, gives us careful exhortations to watch out for, in particular, self-promotion. We need to be on guard against this. We need to constantly be vigilant because it's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those are the three temptations. And so I think the best antidote is John the Baptist's statement when they tried to get John, to provoke John's selfish ambition, when John had baptized Jesus and most of his disciples were leaving him and going to Jesus, and they came to John and said, everyone's going to this person you baptized. And John the Baptist said this, John chapter 3, verse 27, a man can receive nothing unless it's given to him from heaven. Adonijah should have known that. He should have learned it from his father. Did David take the kingdom? Never did. Didn't hold on to it, didn't take it. If you're going to follow in his example, don't take it, don't hold on to it. Let the Lord do what the Lord wants to do. A man can receive nothing unless it's given to him from heaven. If you want something in your life, ask God to give it to you. If God doesn't give it to you, don't go take it. You let the Lord do it. Promotion doesn't come from the east or the west or the south. It comes from the Lord. So much heartache and drama happen when pride overtakes a person. We'll see it here. We want to avoid self-promotion, and we want to humble ourselves. What does the Bible say? Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and He will exalt you. It says in due time, or you could say when He feels like it. Let the Lord, leave the exaltation to the Lord. My choice is humility. I'll choose humility. The Lord will choose exaltation. That's His prerogative. We will save ourselves from heartache by letting the Lord do the work. And the fact that this guy did exactly what Absalom did, and as though it was going to turn out differently. What happens to Absalom? He dies, right? So what do you think is going to happen to this guy? Now you've read it, so you know what's going to happen. So it's an easy answer. You're like, well, he's going to die. Yeah. Do the same thing that the other guy did that got himself killed? We're not the exception, and this is a good warning for us. And also David's neglect. We see David continually neglectful as a father. You want to learn how to be a father? Don't go to David. Or I guess you can go, if you want to learn how to be a father, go to David and don't do anything David did as a father. And if you find yourself following David's example as a father, quit and do something different. So verse 7 tells us who else is involved. He conferred with Joab and with Abiathar the priest, and they followed and helped Adonijah. So we're seeing this rebellion now. The guy chooses key leaders. He's essentially making a rebellion and promoting himself, and he's got key leaders to join with him in this. He makes his move. As through the story, he gathers together in verse 9, introduces his brothers and other key leaders, but he leaves out, verse 10 tells us, Nathan the prophet and Benaiah and Solomon. So the ones that were in line, that was, through David, there was a leadership succession plan that was in place, and he's subverting that. He's doing his own thing. And he steps in. And then the Lord intervenes. We won't look at all the details of it, but Nathan the prophet comes to Bathsheba, because most likely, as this leadership thing, if it fails and this guy gets in control, he's gonna kill his opposition, which means Bathsheba will die, Solomon will die, Benaiah will die. And so Nathan the prophet, who would also die, he comes to Bathsheba and said, didn't David say that Solomon's going to be king, and this guy has now gathered these people, they've gone, and this is happening right now. He's going to make himself king. They're calling him the king. So Bathsheba goes to speak to David, and Nathan comes in when she's done and reiterates the story. Now, didn't you say this? Isn't Solomon supposed to be the king? Adonijah's gone to do this. And so they get the plan together. And if you'll jump down to verse 32, David then says, they're going to intervene. And David says, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And so they all came before him. And the king said, take with you the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule, and take him down to Gihon, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel, and blow the horn and say, "Long live King Solomon." So there's the plan. This is what I want to do. This is what God wants to have happen. Adonijah's trying to do this thing and subvert it. And so do it right now. I'm not dead. Make him the king. While I'm alive, I'm saying this is what I want to have happen. So they put it into practice. They do exactly what David told them to do. And then the people all are rejoicing. Verse 40, after they blow the trumpet, the people are shouting. Verse 40 says, all the people went up after Solomon, and the people played flutes and rejoiced with great joy, so that the earth seemed to split with their sound. So the transitions happen. Solomon's now the king. It happens in Jerusalem. David's the one he's on David's mule, and so everybody sees it, and all the people have their instruments, and they're all celebrating. And so what about the rebels? Verse 41. Adonijah and all the guests that were with him, they heard as they finished eating. Can you imagine? They're like, man, we got these guys. They're like, let's have a meal. They're eating, and then all of a sudden you're all this noise, it's resonating through the hills, and like, wait, what in the world is that? And so they're not sure, and then Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, comes in, and Adonijah says, well, hey, what have you found out? Verse 43, Jonathan says, our Lord King David has made Solomon the king. Oops. And Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, and the Cherethites and the Pelethites have come, and they've made him ride on the king's mule. And so these other guys are in trouble, and they don't know what to do. They hear about this, and they decide, verse 49, all the guests who were with Adonijah were afraid, and they all got up, and each one went his own way. So here's the thing about being part of a mutiny. If you're part of a mutiny, guess who your teammates are? Pirates. Right? Like if you're part of a mutiny, then you're captain of the mutineers. And so if you've led the mutineers in a mutiny, what have you trained them to do? You trained them to be mutineers. Every disciple becomes like his master. David, in not taking up his hands to kill Saul and to make himself the king, what did he train his men to do? We just leave it to the Lord. And David could have killed Saul in the cave. He could have killed Saul when Saul was asleep and he snuck into the camp. He was with Abishai in the camp, and Abishai said, we'll take him out right now. I will kill him right now. While he's laying there, he'll be dead. And David doesn't become king of the pirates because he's not a pirate. And here's the dangerous thing, and this is very, very important, because churches have splits. Churches split. People create drama within congregations. If you're ever tempted, if you're a Zadok or not Zadok, but Abiathar, or you're these other guys that are around Adonijah, and you're tempted to do this, someone says, "Hey, just remember, you join. Your mutiny is never good. It's never, ever good." I have a friend years ago was going through this, and there was some issues, and the pastor was not doing well, and he kind of had lost the trust of his board. He lost the trust kind of the elders. He lost the trust of his staff, and they were basically had planned a mutiny. And my friend was going to be the guy that was going to become the pastor, and he wanted to talk to me about it, and he asked my advice. He didn't follow my advice, but I said exactly what I just said to you. I said, listen, you got to remember, this is a mutiny, and the mutineers are asking you to be the lead mutineer. And if you join and you lead that, you're going to be captain of the mutineers. And they already ate the one captain. Now you're the next captain. They just developed an appetite for captain. And you're going to lead it. You're going to be the leader of that. You're going to follow. And then he had all the reasons why it was a good idea. And I said, well, it's your choice, but man, I would never do that. I'd resign, let the Lord handle it, find another way to deal with it, but do not be the leader of a mutiny. And all those guys that were part of that mutiny, they all had major shipwrecks, and that poor congregation and their own lives, it just is really sad. I've seen it over and over and over again, and here's another example of it. As soon as they realize we're not going to get anything, these guys are not loyal to him. David's Cherethites and Pelethites, they're still with him. He's so old he can't stay warm in bed. He needs more blankies, and yet these guys are all older guys. They've been through everything together. They've never left him. Why? He was not captain of the mutineers. He was captain of the faithful men. Bunch of mistakes, lots of failure, not perfect in any way, shape, or form. But David had faithful guys because he was a faithful guy. And they learned from him. You don't ever want to be part of a mutiny. It's not worth it. So the people all leave Adonijah, and now he runs into the tabernacle and grabs hold of the horns of the altar, verse 50 says. Don't let me die. And so they hear Solomon, you guys beg him for mercy. And so Solomon says, I won't kill him. It's interesting. Solomon's going to be stuck with a bunch of this stuff that David's left for him. And it's interesting how the Lord gets him out of it. So Solomon does not condemn Adonijah. He said, look, if there's wickedness found in him, he'll bring it on his own head. I'm not going to just execute these guys summarily. So he doesn't. He gives them a strong warning. Verse 53 tells him to go to his house. So now we have David coming to the end. He gives Solomon his final charge. He's, kind of on his deathbed, and he tells Solomon, verse 2, to be strong and prove yourself a man, and he then gives him some commands. If follow the Lord's given us these promises, as my sons will sit on my throne as long as they do what God says, so walk with the Lord. Then, verse 5, deal with Joab. David never dealt with Joab. Joab's a murderer. He's guilty of 2 premeditated murders. He killed 2 guys with foreknowledge. He's guilty of capital crime twice. David never dealt with it, and now he's passed it on to his son. So he tells him, you know what Joab did? Joab needs to be put to death. It begs the question of, Dad, you never dealt with it. Why are you passing this on to me? He's like, well, I did. I'm old. I'm done. He needs to be dealt with. You got to deal with it. So that's Joab. Verse 7, bless Barzillai the Gileadite. He helped us when we were fleeing from Absalom, so make sure that you're always a blessing to him. And then verses 8 and 9, Shimei. Remember the guy that was cussing David out and throwing rocks at him, and Abishai wanted to kill him on the way out and then wanted to kill him on the way back. The guy came back, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'm a dead dog, I don't know, just forgive me. And David said, I'm not going to kill you. And David didn't deal with him, and now David tells Solomon, kill that dude. So this kind of tough final words. Look, follow God. We have the promise of God. Do what God says. Kill Joab. Be nice to Barzillai. And kill Shimei. It's kind of tough. So verse 10, David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. So David's life is over. He reigned for 40 years, verse 11 said. 7 years in Hebron, and in Jerusalem 33 years. And then Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established. So interesting. Right there could be the end of it. Joab's not murdered. Joab is not, no judgment. Like Solomon's just sitting on it. Sort of, we'll just see what the Lord does. And he's not just enacting in a reaction. And so what happens? Adonijah comes, and he's going to get himself in trouble. Solomon said, if there's wickedness in him, then we'll deal with him. And if not, we won't. We'll just see what happens. And Adonijah can't resist himself. He comes to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and he says, look, I've got a request. Will you talk to your son? And I just got one thing I want. Verse 17, here's the request. Speak to King Solomon. He won't refuse you, that he would give me Abishag the Shunammite as wife. Remember, that's why I said at the very beginning, I think we get those first 4 verses of the weird accommodation of, I want to have that girl as my wife. Now, she's not David's wife technically, but he's taking something really that belongs to David and assuming it as though it were his. And Solomon rightly recognizes this is a subversion to the kingdom. And remember, he said, if there's wickedness in you, there's not, you're fine. If there is, you're going to bring it on your own head. And the guy can't resist himself. He wants some of the power. He wants to have the recognition. He wants something. So Bathsheba comes and says to Solomon, hey, I have a question, son. He's like, okay, what do you want, Mom? And so then she says that, what about Abishag to your brother? And so verse 22, Solomon says, why do you ask for Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also. He's my older brother. For him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. And King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, may God do so to me and more also if Adonijah has not spoken this word against his own life. So God's confirmed the kingdom, and this guy's still, these three guys that are out, there's something still brewing, and now that's it. They had a free pass. Their free pass is over. And I'm going to deal with them. So, King Solomon, verse 25, sent Benaiah, and he killed Adonijah. Then he deals with Abiathar in verse 26. He sends him to Anathoth. He's exiled to Anathoth, and he told him, you're deserving of death, verse 26, but I will not put you to death at this time because you carried the ark of the Lord before my father David, and because you were afflicted every time my father was afflicted. Abiathar has a long history. Remember when he comes to David, when David's in the caves, David had got the sword of Goliath from the temple or the tabernacle, and he ate the showbread, took the showbread, and Doeg the Edomite was there. He fled. Doeg told Saul, and then Doeg murdered all those priests, and Abiathar had escaped and came to David in the caves. He's been with David since then. And at this point, at the very end, he wants some of the glory. He's caught up in it. And so Solomon says, look, I'm not going to have you put to death. You go to Anathoth, you're in exile. And that's that's the end of him. He doesn't get killed. He goes to Anathoth. What's interesting about that? Does that name sound familiar to you? Anathoth? Sounds like I'm lisping. Anathoth. Sorry. I do these things when I'm reading the Bible. And I'm alone, so maybe I should just keep them to myself when I'm alone. But some of these words stick in my mind, and I remember, you know what? You know what's interesting about this? You know in Jeremiah chapter 1, when we're introduced to Jeremiah, where's Jeremiah from? Let me read Jeremiah 1:1. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So the guy gets in exile. There's a priestly family, lives in Anathoth, and guess what? Hundreds of years down the road, a godly man comes out of that place. So, it's the grace of God happening through the whole story. So, anyway, he's put in exile, and then Joab. Verse 28, the news came to Joab because Joab had defected to Adonijah, though he had not defected to Absalom. And interesting, Joab's an interesting character. He fled to the tabernacle of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. Why would he do something like that? That's what Adonijah had done, and he got mercy. Thinks, I'll go do that. Grabs the altar, and Benaiah is sent by King Solomon to strike him down, and he goes to the tabernacle and sees the guy hanging onto the altar and says, come out, and Joab says, I ain't coming out. So Benaiah goes back to Solomon, says he won't come out, and Solomon says, fine, kill him. Go in the tabernacle and kill him. He's hanging onto the altar. He's not supposed to be in there. And Benaiah goes in there and kills him. So Joab is put to death. He's executed. He had murdered 2 men in cold blood. David never dealt with it. And now Solomon has to deal with it. And Joab comes to his end. Joab he's an enigma in the Bible. Who's the person who had the bravery and the audacity and the fearlessness to climb up the water shaft and break through and conquer the Jebusite city that becomes the city of David, that becomes Jerusalem? It's Joab. And at the same time as you have that, he's one of David's, he's a leader of David's men, but he's not listed in the mighty men. His name is not in that list. His brother Abishai is, but Joab's not there. It's interesting. It's an interesting character, and his end is tragic. And then the last part of the chapter, so remember this unfinished business, you got the rebellion, you got Joab needs to be judged, and the last character is this Shammai. So Shammai is then spoken to by the king. In verse 36, he's told, you can build yourself a house, you live in Jerusalem, but the day you leave Jerusalem, you're dead. It's your choice. You want to live here and be at peace? You can live here in Jerusalem and be at peace. But the minute you leave the city, you're dead. It's going to be on you. So Shammai does that, and look at verse 39. At the end of 3 years, so time goes on, kind of feels comfortable, forgets about what Solomon said. 3 years goes by, his slaves escape. They've gone down to Gath. He hears about it, doesn't think about it. He leaves. And Solomon had made room for mercy. And the guy doesn't think about it. He goes and gets his slaves. And when he comes back, Solomon has heard that he's left. And Solomon calls him in and said, you were told you're not supposed to leave. The minute you leave, you're dead. It's your own choice. You're dead. You left. And so Solomon had him executed. So Shammai is now dealt with. So that's the unfinished business is now gone. Chapter 3 begins with Solomon's downfall. Now, if you read ahead, you notice that chapter 11 tells us in verse 1, King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, and on and on. Verse 3 tells us he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. And that subject is introduced in chapter 3. He makes an accommodation, and it's political. Look at verse 3, or chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. It's very common in the ancient world. Political alliances are made between the leaders, and then a daughter of one of the kings is given to the other king in marriage, and that kind of seals, like my daughter's there, I'm not going to come and attack. My daughter's there, I'm not going to come and attack. We're sort of now in the same family, and so we're going to keep our treaty, which in some way makes sense, but it's forbidden for Israel. For the kings of Israel, it's not supposed to happen. And Solomon violates that, and this is the beginning of that, so it's going to ultimately lead to his downfall. His marriage to unbelievers and sealing these treaties and multiplying wives, a huge mistake. So it's interesting, you can make a decision that might make sense financially. You can make a decision that might secure your promotion. You can make a decision that's going to open the doors for you. And they might be the doors to your grave. They might be the doors to the mausoleum. Not every decision is a good decision. And it could be financially, you think it's going to work, but it's not good. Especially with Solomon. He could, I'm sure, justify this. So now we get Solomon. In the meantime, though, that's just the introduction of that thought. But for the rest of our chapter, Solomon's in a good place spiritually. Verse 3 tells us he loved the Lord. They don't have the temple yet, and he does sacrifice on the high places, but he is walking with the Lord and walking in the statutes of his father David. The worship should be taking place in the tabernacle, and the sacrifices should be taking place in the tabernacle. And this mention of worshiping on the high places, you're going to see it through the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings and in the Chronicles. A high place literally is a high place. A point of prominence, a little bit higher, build an altar there, and that's where you worship. But that's outside of the tabernacle, and it's an accommodation that makes it easier for people. Well, you're worshiping the Lord, we're just doing it on the high place. Well, you're supposed to be doing it in the tabernacle. Well, it's easier. And so it's a backsliding. It's more convenient. And Solomon now, David doesn't really do it, but worshiping on the high places is going to become a problem for Israel, and it's sort of introduced right here as well. But Solomon in general loves the Lord, and he's following in the footsteps of his father. And then he has this dream. This is a famous part of Solomon's life when verse 5, God says to him, ask what I should give you. God appears to him and says, ask me, what do you want? And I thought this is always very significant. This is the question. What do you want? What do you want? And I really believe that this is something that God says to, I think, really every human being, and almost, I would say, every single day. What do you want? What is it that you want? What are you after? What are you seeking? What do you desire? What do you want? Ask me what you want. And that question reveals where our heart is. And Solomon is blessed because he doesn't ask for riches or wealth or long life. Riches, long life, whatever. The normal thing someone would ask for, like you got a genie, right? Rub the lamp. What do you want? Well, I want infinity wishes, I want more. You give me 3 wishes, I wish for 3 times 3 wishes. What is it that you want? Solomon, in a way, is a wonderful thing. He says, look, you've done these things for my father. You've made me the king. you've kept your word, and now I'm in charge of all these people. And so he says, I need understanding to judge your people, to lead your people, in verse 9. Give me wisdom. And so God said to him, you didn't ask for long life or riches or your enemies, so you've asked for wisdom, so I'm going to give you that wisdom, and I'm going to give you those other things as well. So Solomon's praised for not asking for foolish things, but I would suggest to you something as you think about how to apply this to your own life. If God came to you, and I would suggest to you that he does, what is it that you want? And be careful what you ask for. Remember what David said? David tells us in the Psalms what he would ask for. He says, one thing have I desired of the Lord, and that's what I'll seek after, that I would have wisdom to lead God's people. That's not what he said. One thing have I desired of the Lord. Psalm 27, verse 4. You know it by heart. That I've desired of the Lord, and that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. I just want God. I want God in my life. I want to be in the temple of God. And if you look at David's life, and you look at Solomon's life, and you see David, he can't build the temple because he's got blood on his hands. He's murdered Uriah the Hittite. He's been a bad father. His family's, three of his sons are killed, right? Executed. Amnon is murdered by Absalom. Absalom's murdered by Joab. Adonijah is murdered, after the rebellion by Solomon. I mean, the sword hasn't departed from his house. He's done these. He's a sinner, right? And then you look at Solomon. Solomon didn't sin in those ways, but Solomon sinned in a way. His heart is turned away from the Lord. And you can never really say that about David. And David has, if God asks you, what do you want? You make sure you ask for the very best thing. Lord, I want a relationship with you. I want to love you. I want to know you. I want to be yours. I want you to be mine. And if you only let me ask for one thing, that's what I'm asking for. And, wisdom will come out of that. Everything else that I need will come out of that. But the most important thing, I think David had a better answer than Solomon. I'm not saying this to criticize Solomon's, but I think it's important for us as we think about how this might apply to us. God asking you, what do you want? I would say that on behalf of God, knowing what the Word of God says, God's inviting you right now. Ask me what you will. Didn't Jesus say, ask whatever you want in my name, I'll do it. All right, Lord, I want $1 million. And the Lord's like, oh, no, think harder. Ask deeper. Dig a little deeper. Meditate. What is it that you really want? If you got $1 million, is that what you really want? Well, I want to not have any problems. I want, what is it that you want? That's the Spirit of God working in our lives. And so Solomon asks for wisdom. God gives him wisdom and gives him this promise. And then the rest of the chapter, the second half of the chapter, is an example of the wisdom. I can remember reading through this. The very first time I read the Bible, I'd never heard this story. I remember reading the Bible. I got to 1 Kings. I'm reading through this. And I remember hearing the story, and I was like, dude, how will you know? Like, oh my gosh. No one knows. This is a true story. These two prostitutes come. They got one kid between them. They supposedly had two kids. One's dead, one's alive. And then they both are claiming the alive one is theirs, and there's been a switcheroo. And so there's no witnesses. And I remember reading this thinking, man, how will they know? Whose baby is it? And I remember thinking, maybe they could just trade off, like split custody or something, I didn't know what to think. And I remember thinking, Solomon said, bring me a sword. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's not wise. He's like this. What? He got ripped off. Lord, he needs help. And he says, cut the kid in half. I remember reading this. I didn't know how it was going to turn out. Cut the kid in half. I was like, no, don't kill the kid. You can't. Oh my gosh, what kind of a suggestion is this? And then I was like, oh man, that's genius. Right? It's a great plan. Why? Because the wisdom from God is to see underneath the situation, right? What's the heart of the matter? This is a great example of, the woman who really loves the kid unconditionally is going to be the one. She'll sacrifice. She'd rather sacrifice herself than sacrifice the kid. So everybody hears that and they realize that God has given Solomon this supernatural wisdom, and he found a way to tell the difference. So chapter 4, some of these chapters will just sort of refer to them because they have details that just don't mean a lot to us. But chapter 4 gives us sort of the names of those that are his main leaders, the key officials, the first 6 verses, the commander-in-chief, the recorder, the scribes, the chief priests. Then starting in verse 7, we're told that he divided the nation up into 12 governors. And why would that be? How many tribes have land allotments? Well, there's 12. So get a governor from all the tribes. This makes sense. Someone representing them from their own people, but they're responsible to Solomon to govern the regions. And it goes through a description of the areas that they're in charge of, the regional governors. Then starting in verse 20, we're told kind of on a larger scale of his reign that verse 20 says that if you try to count Israel, it's more than the sand of the seashore. There's so many people. And verse 21, he reigns from the kingdoms from the river, from the Euphrates, all the way down to the coast of the Philistines, all the way down to Egypt, and everybody brings tribute. So all the nations around Israel are part of Solomon's reign, so to speak. He has peace around from all of his neighbors. An announcement of how much food comes into him, and it must have been an amazing banquet every single day. We read about all the different kinds of animals there. Verse 25, sort of a summary statement. Judah, all of Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan, that's the far north, all the way down to Beersheba in the south, all the days of Solomon. So the whole nation has peace. Everyone's blessed. We're told about his stables and his tables in the last part of the chapter. 40,000 stalls for horses, the stables, and then we're told about all the food that comes into his place. God gave him all this wisdom, more wisdom than all these people. Verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. That's amazing. If you want to know how amazing that is, try to make one proverb. Try to make one proverb that everybody, long after you're gone, would say, man, that's a true statement. The guy made 3,000 proverbs. That's amazing. And he wrote 1,005 songs. Now, if you think that's not that big of a deal, try to write one song that makes any sense. I mean, it's hard to write a song. The guy's got 1,000 songs and 3,000 proverbs. And he knew about everything. Verse 33, he knew about trees, the cedar trees of Lebanon, hyssop that springs out of a wall. He spoke about animals, birds, creeping things, fish. Solomon had this wisdom about sort of every field of study. If it was horticulture, zoology, classification of animals, just every part of life. He just had this wisdom from God, and everybody came to hear his wisdom. And chapter 5 is sort of setting the stage for the building of the temple. Because Hiram, verse 1 of chapter 5, he's the king of Tyre. Tyre is a city that's right on the seashore. That's north of Israel. So it'd be like Lebanon, north of Israel on the coast. And Tyre and Sidon were sister cities. They're ancient cities. The city of Tyre that exists today is not on the same site as the ancient city. The city of Tyre, there's still a city today named Tyre, and it's right on the coast. And the king of that area had been friends of David. They were very close. Verse 1 says that Hiram had always loved David, and he heard about Solomon being the king. And so I think David had already been working. David had accumulated a lot of wealth. He'd already talked to Hiram about the building of the temple. And so now David has passed, and so Solomon and Hiram are going to connect, and Hiram is going to provide the lumber, the timbers for the temple. So verse 6, the request comes in this letter. He says, command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon. So the timbers that are used in the building of the temple are these major cedar trees, old growth, cedar. Can you imagine the beauty of that wood and the smell of the tabernacle? I mean, it's all going to be overlaid with gold, so maybe they lose some of the fragrance of it. But you imagine timbers, that cedar timbers, massive trees that they bring down. And so Hiram hears that. He's super blessed by that. He gives glory to God in verse 7. Blessed be the Lord, because he's given David a wise son. And so he sends him back a message saying, yeah, let's do it. He tells them how they're going to do it. Look at verse 9. My servants will bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. So we'll go up, we'll lumberjack them down, we'll cart them down to the sea, and then he says, I'll float them in rafts by sea to the place you indicate to me, and we'll have them broken apart there, and then you can take them away. So we'll harvest them, we'll lumberjack them, we'll cart them down to the sea, we'll lash them all together, and then we'll just take them in the water and float them down to Israel. And the Mediterranean, they don't get massive storms, so there can be good surf, but most of the time I've been in Israel, even when there's been waves, hasn't been gigantic. So a lot of times it's pretty flat, so you can just float. We'll just float them down there, have a big flotilla of cedars, and we'll float them down to Israel, and then you can take them from there and bring them up to Jerusalem. So that's the plan. We're told that Solomon pays for all this, verse 11. Large amount of food. Hiram had asked for food for his household, so he gives them a bunch of wheat and pressed oil, and he gives it to them every year. And so they make a treaty together, verse 12. They've got peace between them, and so they make this plan, and Solomon has this labor force of 30,000 people. They go up in shifts, and they work carrying burdens, and he has all these guys cutting stones and doing all the preparing for the building. Now, chapter 6 then tells us the building begins officially. Verse 1, it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So what book do they come out of the land of Egypt? Exodus, right? So how many years have we covered since Exodus? We're now in 1 Kings. We've got 480 years. So there's your time. You guys that are Western thinkers, you need a timeline. There's your time marker. So how interested is the Bible in giving us time markers? Not that interested. It's not a time-oriented culture. So some of you who like to tell a story by rambling and jumping all over the place in chronological order doesn't mean anything to you. You're very biblical. And so you should enjoy reading the Bible. And those of you that want everything super structured and linear and time-oriented, and you read the Bible and you can't figure it out, sorry. That's the way it is. So here's a time marker, 480 years, and they begin building the house. And it's described in its dimensions there at the beginning. We're not going to go into all the details of this, but all clear description about the width and height of everything and stuff being fastened together. Verse 7 is an interesting statement. The temple, when it was being built, was built with stone, finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. Now this is interesting because remember, when they were building an altar, God told them he didn't want tools involved. So Solomon takes this so seriously that even when they're quarrying the main stones, all the quarrying and hammering and chiseling is done away from the city, and then the mighty stones are brought up. So very, very, must have been quite a production. And God speaks to Solomon in verse 11. He says, giving him a charge concerning this temple which you're building, if you walk in my statutes and execute my judgments and keep my commandments and walk in them, I'll perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will not forsake my people Israel. So he's encouraged in the work. But it's interesting, the way God speaks to Solomon, and we'll get more detail when we get into 1st and 2nd Chronicles about this, because that's the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. So there's some details there. We'll focus on those when we get to those books. We'll stick with the details are here. But the emphasis in 1 Kings, as God speaks to Solomon related to the temple, God encourages him about the temple, but every time God speaks to him, encouraging him about the temple, he always brings him back to obedience. The temple is not a substitute for obedience. The temple is part of their relationship with the Lord, but having a temple doesn't mean you can disobey. Like, well, I can disobey and then I just go to the temple. God's really careful with Solomon to say, do what I say, obey me. That's the promise that I gave your fathers related to your obedience. Yes, build the temple. The temple's not a substitute for obedience. We're going to quickly go through 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll be at the destruction of the temple, and it'll almost be anticlimactic. We'll go, we were so excited a few weeks ago. They were just building it, and now the Babylonians are carrying it away, And so we have to remember why. It's this God's emphasis is on the obedience, and they leave that. The temple is not a substitute for that. So Solomon builds the temple, and the temple's finished, it says in verse 14. We know that took 7 years. So we're told about all the wood, the building of it on the inside. From verse 15 to verse 22, all the carving, and then everything is overlaid with gold. Verse 21, Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold. The floor, the walls, everything that's made out of wood, it's all this amazing cedar wood, and then all the wood is overlaid with gold. So if you walked into the temple of Solomon, what does it look like? It's all gold. They've carved all this ornate carving in the wood of cherubs and then palm trees and pomegranates and all the different things that they carved, and it's all overlaid with gold. Just spectacular. Amazing beauty. We're told about the Holy of Holies, in particular, these giant angels that he makes for inside the Holy of Holies, verses 23 to 28. Their height is 10 cubits, so they're 15 feet tall. And then they face each other, and their heads are down, and their wings come across, and they fill the whole Holy of Holies and they're carved out of wood, and then they're overlaid with gold. So the ark has the two cherub that are on top of the ark. The ark's made out of wood, but overlaid with gold, and their wings are touching. And then it's set. The ark is set, and then underneath these giant angels that are overlaid with gold. The temple must have been really unbelievable to see. Then starting in verse 29, we're told about all the other carvings and the door panels and all the things that he built. The end of the chapter, verses 37 and 38, tells us that it took 7 years to build. And then chapter 7, verse 1 said it took Solomon 13 years to build his own house. And so he finished his house. And chapter 7 gets into other building projects. Solomon was quite a builder. So the temple, there was a concerted effort. They finished it in 7 years. He took more time to build his house, probably not the same amount of national involvement, but everybody was all in on the temple. So then he builds his house. So he had a magnificent mansion. He has other mansions. Verses 2 through 5 is a house that's called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. So what kind of wood do you think that house is made out of? The House of the Forest of Lebanon. It's cedar. He's got a beautiful cedar mansion that must have been awesome. Verse 6, another house called the House of Pillars. And it's quite a structure as well. Verse 7, a hall of judgment. So that place is built, and that was where he would sit when he was sitting in judgment. And then verses 8 through 12, his house is described for us. He had built a house for Pharaoh's daughter, and this is a house that he's made for himself that's kind of like the one that he made for her. And then we're told about this character, verse 13, who's also named Hiram. We have Hiram, who's the king of Tyre, who makes the treaty with him. But this is another guy who was sent by Hiram from Tyre. His name is also Hiram. So you got two Hirams from the same place. One is the king, and one is a very, very skilled worker with metal. He's an artist and very diligent, hard worker. He's one of those artists who can meet deadlines. I'm not thinking of any artists that I know, so don't think I'm thinking of anybody that you know, but maybe like, I'm trying to think of an artist. I have an artist in mind, and none of you know this person. I may or may not be related to them. But not all artists can meet deadlines. Not all artists, some people are really artistic and it's all in their head and they can never totally get it all out. Or this guy is kind of the best of every world. He's got this amazing skill set and he can get the job done. He can mobilize other people. He can delegate work. This guy is really, really gifted. And it's an interesting application is whenever God's going to do something, God raises up the people to do it. And my personal experience has been with the Lord, I don't get to do everything I want to do, and neither can we organize and do everything that we theoretically could think of that we would want to do. But everything that God wants to do, He does it. And if we would just sort of look to him and rely upon him and sort of let the Lord do it and not try to make something happen. If he's not doing it, God will do it. And God raises up the people, and he raises up this guy, very, very gifted guy. And so he comes, and he's introduced to us in verse 13, and we begin to hear about all this brass work that happens. So the temple, because Solomon had accumulated so much gold and so much silver, the weights of those are always given to us, but I think when it comes to the silver, we're told there's so much silver they can't even count it, but brass, they don't even try. He's accumulated so much brass, it's a precious metal. He's accumulated so much they can't even count it. And so these massive things are made out of brass. He builds these two pillars that actually are so prominent that they get nicknames. So when you build something out of metal that's so awesome that you give it a name, like that's Boaz. And he makes these things, they're huge, they're a prominent point in the front of the temple. They're 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measures the circumference. These things are huge, and it's all brass. Quite amazing. And then there's this amazing artwork all around it. They have these bases and tops that are covered with all this fancy work, and they're described for us. Verse 21 tells us their nicknames. One is called, Randy could pronounce this for you later and tell you what they mean, but they're given nicknames. And then we're told about the bathtub that the priests are supposed to wash. Remember, the priests do washing. Well, he makes this amazing brass. It's called a sea. It's cast out of brass, the bronze laver. It's amazing, and it's sitting on top of these oxen, and they're all looking out. It must have been something, and so that's described for us. Down to verse, let's see. Bronze carts are described. So all the things that are going to be used in the worship, the moving of the sacrifices, the ashes, and all that. Everything's made out of brass. It's all described as very ornate. Verse 48, we'll jump down all the stuff is made out of brass. Hiram builds all of it. He's delegated all this stuff out, so it's quite a project. It's summarized for us there through the early 40 verses. And then we're told, verse 47, Solomon didn't even weigh all the articles. There were so many, and the weight of the bronze was not determined. So they just had no lack of material. Solomon made all the furnishings, verse 48, for the house of the Lord. The altar was of gold, the table of gold, on which was the showbread, the lampstands of gold. So all the golden vessels are described up to verse 50, and then a final summary, verse 51. All the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in all the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings. He put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So you got these, what are they, like 20-something feet, 25 feet tall, 27 feet tall pillars, all brass. The whole inside is overlaid with gold, table of gold, altar of gold, these amazingly artistic carts to move the ashes, and everything that the priests need, everything is there. It's this amazing stones that's the foundation on the Temple Mount that has been made. It's an incredible thing that's been done. And that gets us into chapter 8. They bring in the ark. They're going to inaugurate the temple. And they bring in the ark from the city of David, from the tabernacle. And verse 2 tells us when it happens. They come up. They bring the ark of the Lord. They put all the furnishings. Everything is in there. They're offering sacrifices in verse 5. The priests come in to bring in the ark. They put it in its place underneath those cherubim. And then, verse 10. It came to pass when the priests came out of the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord. What cloud? Well, I didn't read about a cloud before this in this section, but we have heard about a cloud before, haven't we? When they were going through the wilderness and they were wandering in the wilderness, how did they know when to go? The pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by the day. And the cloud would move and they would go, the presence of God. So remember, on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus is transfigured and God descends, and what covers the top of the Mount of Transfiguration? And God speaks out of the cloud. It's really interesting. If you want to do an interesting concordance search Search cloud and see all through the Bible, every time this cloud happens. Well, here's one of the places it happens. They set the thing up. It's amazing. And what happens? Something more amazing that makes gold look like what it is, a rock. The glory of God. A cloud descends upon the temple and obscures everything and is so glorious and so powerful, they can't go in. Look at verse 11. The cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priest could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. You know, the golden walls must have been awesome, but that cloud, I guarantee you, was more awesome. They could go in when it was all golden and amazing. They could not go in when the glory of God filled the place. It was too much. It was too powerful. I've always thought this was wonderful of the Lord to do this for Israel. He's let them have this amazing thing, but in giving it to them, he reminded them that he is infinitely more amazing, infinitely more glorious. And the glory of the Lord fills the place, and so they're unemployed. They just got the thing set up, and now they can't do anything. We should do it. We can't. You go in. I'm not going in. The glory of the Lord's filled the place. We'll wait for the Lord to relax, and the cloud recedes, and then we'll know that it's safe. But otherwise, God's descended on the place. We can't do anything. And so then Solomon turns and blesses the people, and reminds them of what's happened and how David was forbidden from building the temple. And so he speaks to the people. And then verse 22, he prays. And man, is this a long prayer? Have you ever prayed with people and they pray this long? So, when we pray together with the men in our men's prayer meeting, we always try to remind the guys, keep your prayers short so it's like a conversation. You know, you don't go to Starbucks with a friend and one of you talks for a half hour and the other person talks for a half hour. You talk and you talk and you talk back and forth. Someone shares something. So Solomon is doing this is a prayer that is very public and it's a long prayer. And he reminds them in the first part of the prayer that God has kept his promises. There's no other God except for God. Verse 23, he's kept his promise. Verse 24 and verse 25. And so then in verse 26, now I'm going to ask you, Lord, now that your words come true. And the first thing he says, verse 27, will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I've built? I suppose the cloud helped with that theological reality. As you really can't calculate the amount of money that's involved in building the thing. It's incomprehensible, the amount of gold. And yet Solomon, as amazing as this thing is, God, we didn't build you a house. God doesn't live in a house on the earth. So be careful about saying that when you came to church, you came to God's house. We have an advantage because we used to meet in a grammar school. Before we met in the grammar school, we met in an office building on the other side of town. We met in a high school gymnasium and a high school cafeteria. Now we meet in a light industrial building. So we know this isn't God's house. God doesn't live at 2212 Cawson. Where does God live? He lives in your heart. That's one place on earth you can be sure that he lives. And at this point, he wasn't living in people's hearts. And Solomon realizes and rightly recognizes and emphasizes this is not a house. Heaven cannot contain God. And his majesty, if his glory comes upon this place, we won't even be able to enter the place. God is infinitely more valuable and more glorious than anything that we've done. And so he begins to pray, and it's interesting what he asks. Look at verse 29. He asks specifically that God's eyes would be open toward this temple night and day. And he said, the place where you said, my name will be there, that you will hear the prayer which your servant makes towards this place. And Solomon is now going to pray specifically about the temple and its role in the national life as a place that would remind the people of God, whatever the situation is. And it's a very long prayer. We're not going to read it all, but just to summarize it, verses 31 and 32, he's going to be several scenarios. Scenario number 1, verse 31 and 32, when anyone sins. So if someone's sinning, someone's come up, something's going on, and they pray, they remember God. Something's happened, they've sinned, they remember God, and they turn towards the temple to pray. Please hear their prayer and have mercy on them. Verses 33 and 34, when you're defeated by your enemies because they've turned their back on you. And goes back to Deuteronomy. They're told these things are going to happen. If you walk away from me, one of you can chase 1,000, but if you walk away from me, 1,000 of you are going to be chased by one person. So when you're defeated by your enemies, if they come to their senses and they come back and pray, then hear their prayer. Verses 35 and 36, when there's a drought. And we'll get to that in the reading for next week, right? Elijah says there's going to be a drought. We know from Solomon, what do you do when there's a drought? You could tell Ahab and Jezebel what to do, but they don't want it. They're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. But when there's a drought, turn back. Verses 37 through 40, when there's a famine. Verses 41 through 43, look at verse 41. When there's a foreigner, concerning a foreigner, a stranger who's not of the people of Israel, but he's come from a far country for your name's sake, they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your outstretched arm. And when he comes and prays toward the temple, so even a stranger, if they think of you and they direct their prayer towards the temple, please hear them. Verses 44 and 45, when they go out to battle, hear their prayers. And then the last thing he asks about it, verses 46 all the way through verse 53, when they sin against you and you destroy this place and you scatter them among the nations, when they turn towards this place and they pray, hear them. Now, what's interesting about that? Do you remember Daniel when he's in Babylon? And his custom is to do what? His windows are open. Which direction? Towards the west, towards Jerusalem. And Daniel's custom is to face towards Jerusalem and do what? Pray. Why is he doing that? It's right here. Daniel has a promise in the Word of God that when we go into captivity, and in our captivity we remember the Lord and we turn back toward that place, Lord, will you hear and will you answer? Now, we'll look at God's answer here in just a second, and the answer is very brief in 1 Kings. The answer is more detailed and more specific in the Chronicles account of this. But God gives them the promise that God will hear and answer. So even when they're in captivity. So Solomon anticipates all of this, and essentially his prayer request is, Lord, hear their prayers when they remember you and come back to you, and let this temple play a role in that. Then he blesses the people. Starting in verse 55, he blesses the Lord and blesses the people and asks for God to answer. And then starting in verse 62 to the end, they offered this major sacrifice. It's a whole national holiday, the inauguration of the temple. And these numbers are sort of staggering. Verse 63, he offered sacrifices of peace offerings, 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. Amazing. So everybody in the nation's participating in this. And they consecrate the altar, and they have a major feast. Verse 65, he held a feast, and all Israel with him. So national holiday, everybody's feasting. From which location? From the brook of Egypt. So from the farthest south to the farthest north, everybody is celebrating. And then on the 8th day, he sent the people away and they blessed the king, and they went to their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the good that the Lord had done for his servant David and for Israel his people. So the temple is all set up. Then God speaks to him in response to his prayer in chapter 9. He answers his prayer. He appears to him again. In verse 3, the Lord said, I've heard your prayer and your supplication you've made before me. Now, Chronicles will tell us specifically, God says, the things you ask for, I'm going to do it. Kings leaves that out. In 1 Kings, the emphasis is this. Look what God says. I've heard your prayer. I've consecrated this house which you've built to put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. And look immediately, God then says, verse 4, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, to do according to all that I've commanded you, if you keep my statutes and my judgments, I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons at all turn from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I've set before you, but you go and you serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I've given them. And this house which I've consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. As for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? And they'll answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, and who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and they've embraced other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity on them. So the emphasis from the Lord in the inauguration is obedience. And this is really important because there seems to be a problem with our human nature that the ceremony of religion can be continued to participate in while we're walking in disobedience. And because we have the one, we think that we can get away with disobedience. But God is very careful to tell them. And this reminds me of in the days of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah is warning the people, and he says, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. You're saying the temple of the Lord, but you're walking in disobedience, and you're going to the temple as though the temple is a substitute for a relationship with God, and it's not. So that's the warning from the Lord. Then verse 10, we get back to verses 10 through 14, part of the arrangement that they had between Solomon and Hiram, it goes south. They had some kind of contract about some cities, and Hiram says, these cities are junk, and so they call it the land of junk. That's Kabul, right? Good for nothing, literally. These places are Kabul, and so they kind of nicknamed it that. He didn't like it, but apparently the contract was a contract, so they dealt with it. They managed to work their way through it, and then we're told about, from the rest of the chapter, verse 15 to 23, the forced laborers that he had for all of his building projects. He had the laborers that were from Israel, that were paid laborers, but all the Amorites and Hittites, verse 20, the Perizzites, all the people of the land that Israel was occupying, he put them to forced labor, but not the Jewish people. And then verse 25, 3 times a year, Solomon would have the big offerings for the whole nation. And then the last part tells us about his fleet of ships. And this is interesting to note. I think it's important because later we'll see kings trying to mimic this, and it doesn't work. But Solomon is being blessed, and so they're able to even travel to Ophir, and they come back with gold. Then chapter 10, we studied this morning. The Queen of Sheba comes. Verse 1 tells us her motive. She heard of the fame of chapter 10, verse 1. She heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. And so she came to test him with hard questions. She literally came to check it out. I heard about this, but I want to see for myself. And she had a stirring in her heart and a hunger. Jesus actually refers to her and says that she will rise up in judgment on the judgment day with the generation of Pharisees and the leaders of Israel of his day, and she's going to condemn them because she came to hear Solomon and they won't listen to Jesus, and Jesus is much greater than Solomon. So Solomon answers all of her questions, spoke about everything that was in her heart, and her response is so interesting. She saw everything that happened and especially how he approached the Lord, and she said in verse 6 and 7, it's a true report that I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I didn't believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. And happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. And look at verse 9. Blessed be the Lord your God. The Lord is, again, all capitals Lord. That's the name of God, Jehovah, Yahweh, the great I am. She now knows the name of God. She was in her land with questions. She's made the journey to Israel, and now she knows the name of God. Blessed be the Lord your God, who's delighted in you. Because the Lord has loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. And she gave the king a bunch of gold and then a huge amount of spices. Spices are so valuable. Think of the British, expanse of their kingdom. Spices become such an expensive commodity, and she brought this great wealth of spices. We're also told that at the same time as that was happening, this very rare kind of wood that came to him, and they were able to make instruments out of it. And verse 13, to finish her story, King Solomon gave her whatever she wanted, and she went back to her country with her servants. Verse 14, this is an interesting verse. Did you notice this number? The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666. That's not the right amount of talents of gold. Solomon was accumulating wealth, and remember, the kings were not supposed to multiply 3 things. Moses said, you're going to have a king, and God said, don't let him multiply 3 things. What are they? Gold, wives, and horses. Solomon is famous for 2 of those. That's not good to be famous for doing 2 things that God said of 3 things you're not supposed to do. I mean, he's in big trouble here. He has so much gold. The rest of this chapter we can just sort of summarize so we can finish. He has so much gold. Verse 17, he makes frisbees. Okay? It's called a shield. But a shield that's made out of gold is not a shield. It's a disc. They have so much gold, he doesn't know what to do with it, so they make it into saucers. 300 shields of hammered gold, and 3 minas of gold go into each shield, and then he puts them in his mansion that's made out of cedars. He also, verse 18, has a great throne made of ivory, and then that is overlaid with gold. When that guy sits on his big shot throne, it is made out of ivory, and the whole thing is overlaid with gold. We're told what it looks like. It has these 12 lions there and these amazing steps that go up. Everything that he drank out of, verse 21, is made out of gold. When you go to the Lebanon house, everything's made out of gold. Nothing is made out of silver. So Solomon doesn't believe in silverware. He doesn't use silverware. It's only goldware. He has merchant marine that travel around the Mediterranean, probably even heading around to Africa, and they bring back whatever they can find. 3 years, they're gone. And they come back, verse 22 says, with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. You know, he sort of has a zoo, if you will. They're bringing back these exotic animals. And I wouldn't want a monkey, but Solomon wanted one. He was the richest man on the earth, verse 23 said. Everyone was coming around to hear his wisdom and that God put in his heart, and when they would come, they would bring him their gifts so they could hear from him. Verse 26, he had chariots and horsemen. Not a lot in general compared to some of the other numbers of some of the other kingdoms, but this was something they weren't supposed to do, but he does it. Verse 27, he made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. He made cedar trees as abundant as sycamores. He got horses from Egypt, which they were specifically forbidden from doing, but he got into the horse trading business, and we're exporting those throughout the Fertile Crescent. And then we'll end there. But notice, just so you're ready for where we're headed, this was the good part. So your reading starting for next week is the bad part. Well, Lord willing, getting into the next section, we'll be able to finish it. But look at verse 1. King Solomon, but King Solomon loved many foreign women. And verse 4, it was so when Solomon was old that his wives had turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So we'll start to see a succession of kings and coups. The kingdom will be divided after Solomon's death. Rehoboam will be the king in the south, and Jeroboam will become the king in the north. Jeroboam will introduce idolatry, and the northern kingdom will never come out of idolatry. They won't have a good king. They'll have a series of bad kings until they're destroyed by the Assyrians. The south has ups and downs, but they ultimately are destroyed by the Babylonians. So, what have we learned? I was thinking about this, and just to conclude, I've always thought, Israel has 3 kings, right? There's Saul, then there's David, then there's Solomon, then the kingdom split. I've always thought of it in that way, but as we've been going through it, maybe because we're going through it faster, here's the names of the people who have been kings so far. Saul, Ishbosheth, David, Absalom, Sheba, Adonijah, and Solomon. So it's not quite as clean as I was in my mind thinking of it. The lust of human beings for power knows no bounds. So just get ready. as you read into the next chapters, and we'll get in from the rest of 1 Kings and all of 2 Kings, you're just going to see what you see on TV when you see our government or the world's governments or whatever. It's sad. But we kind of have already had it, right? There's been quite a few attempts at, I will be king. And that doesn't work out very well. So don't make yourself a king. Just humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and let him exalt you in due time. So Lord, bless your word to our hearts and encourage us. Thank you for making us the temple of God. And thank you, Lord, for your word. May we all apply it to our lives, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.